everyone, and welcome along to my channel. My name is Gaz and this is 7 Minutes in Hell Serial Killer Showcase. Today we're going to be looking at a serial killer with such nicknames as the Killer Granny, the Boarding House Killer, or the Black Widow of Sacramento. Today we're going to be talking about the life and crimes of Dorothea Puente.
We have just learned that Sacramento homicide detectives say they are digging up what they believe is the remains of at least one body.
We found the femur bone of a human being. Obviously, we assume the rest of the body is there.
Joe, is there reason to believe there are other bodies buried at this home at 1426 F Street?
We have some indication of that.
In 1988, in a quiet Sacramento neighborhood, the warm summer months brought with it a sweet, sickly odor emanating from one specific place, and everyone in the neighborhood knew where it was coming from. It was coming from the back garden of a beautiful pale blue Victorian house at 1426 F Street. The owner of the house, from first impressions at least, was a sweet elderly lady called Dorothea Puente. Before we jump into all the juicy details of the crimes committed by the most grisliest of gruesome grannies, let's give you all a bit of background, because to try and understand, if we can at all, what actually happened, we need to look at the events that led up to it. Dorothea Puente, as she became widely known, was born Dorothea Helen Gray on January 9, 1929 in Redlands, California to Trudy May and Jesse James. She did have a bit of a traumatic childhood. Both of her parents were alcoholics and her father died of tuberculosis in 1937. Her mother also died in a motorbike accident just a year later. This led to Dorothea being put into an orphanage, and as was common in many of them kinds of institutions at that time, she was very badly sexually abused. Years later though, Dorothea would marry for the first time in 1945 at the age of just 16 to an army veteran named Fred McFall, who had just returned from the Pacific Theatre of War in World War II. The couple had 2 children between the years of 1946 and 1948, but unable to cope with the stress and the strains of parenthood, they put one of the children to relatives up in Sacramento and the other child was put into an orphanage. It would actually turn out that McFall would leave Dorothea in 1948, just after Dorothea had suffered a miscarriage with their third child. And then in the spring of 1948, Dorothea was arrested for purchasing women's accessories using forged checks in the city of Riverside in California.
You're going to jail!
She was subsequently charged and she pled guilty to 2 counts of forgery. She served 4 months in jail and she got 3 years probation for her crimes. Six months after her release from jail though, she left Riverside and went to San Francisco, and in 1952 she married a merchant seaman called Axel.
Welcome to the jungle!
No, not that Axel. This man was named Axel Johansson, and it was when she met this man that I believe that the full-on downward spiral of Dorothea Puente began. It was while with Johansson that Dorothea created a fake persona for herself, calling herself Tea Sengola Niarda, and claimed that she was a Muslim of Israeli and Egyptian descent. So, as you can probably guess, they had a bit of a turbulent marriage. To begin with, she would take advantage of Johansson's frequent trips to sea by inviting men to their home and gambling away all of his money. And then in 1960, she was arrested again for owning and operating a brothel under the guise of a bookkeeping firm.
You're going to jail!
She was found guilty and she was sentenced to 90 days in county jail. Just a year later, in 1961, her husband Johansson had her briefly committed to Jewett State Hospital after a binge of drinking, lying, criminal behavior and suicide attempts. While she was there, doctors diagnosed her as being a pathological liar with an unstable personality. She got divorced from Johansson in 1966, but would continue to use Johansson's name for some time to come following their separation, This allowed her to assume the identity of Sharon Johansson, and in doing this she could hide all of her delinquent behaviour by portraying herself as a kind, caring Christian woman. She began to establish a reputation as a caregiver, providing young women with sanctuary from poverty and abuse without even charging them. In 1968, Dorothea got married again to Roberto Puente, and after 16 months of marriage, the couple separated, with Dorothea citing domestic abuse as the main cause. But despite the couple divorcing, Dorothea continued to use the surname Puente for more than 20 years. Following the divorce though, she decided to do something positive, so Dorothea focused mainly on running a boarding house located on 21st and F Streets in Sacramento. By all accounts, Dorothea ran a tight ship at the boarding house. Boarders would pay $350 a month for a private room and 2 hot meals a day. Breakfast would be at 6:30 a.m. and dinner at 3:30 p.m. Dorothea was actually an accomplished cook and would make these massive breakfasts of pancakes and bacon and eggs. But if residents missed either meal, they went hungry. They weren't allowed to go into the kitchen at odd hours and just please themselves. They also weren't allowed to touch the phone or the mail. She became a genuine resource in the local community, providing aid to alcoholics and the homeless and the mentally ill. She would even hold Alcoholics Anonymous meetings at the boarding house and help these people sign up to receive Social Security benefits. She also established herself as a respected member of Sacramento's Hispanic community, funding charities and scholarships and radio programs and all kinds of things. During this period of time, she did meet a new partner, and she got married again to a man called Pedro Montalvo. Strangely though, the relationship ended only a week after their marriage began. And for Dorothea, when it rains, it pours. In 1978, she was charged and convicted of illegally cashing 34 state and federal checks that belonged to her tenants. She was given 5 years probation in order to pay $4 grand in restitution. In April of 1982, 61-year-old Ruth MONROE began living with Dorothea in her upstairs apartment of the boarding house, but she soon died from an overdose of codeine and paracetamol. Dorothea would tell the police that the woman was very depressed because her husband was terminally ill. The police believed her and, in turn, ruled the death as a suicide, and nothing more was said about it. But a few weeks later though, the police returned to Dorothea's after Malcolm McKenzie, a 74-year-old pensioner, accused Dorothea of drugging him and stealing from him. And on August 18th of 1982, Dorothea was convicted of 3 theft charges and she was sentenced to 5 years in prison.
You're going to jail!
While she was in prison, she began corresponding with a 77-year-old retiree from Oregon called Everson Gilmuth. A pen-pal friendship very quickly developed, and when Dorothea was released from jail in 1985 after serving only 3 years of a 5-year sentence, Everson met her outside the jail, driving a red 1984 pickup truck. The relationship developed very quickly, and the couple was soon making wedding plans.
What the fuck?
I know, right? In November of 1985 though, Dorothea would hire a man named Ishmael Flores to come and install some wooden paneling for her in a new apartment. For his labour and $800, Dorothea gave him the red pickup truck, and she stated that it belonged to a boyfriend in Los Angeles who no longer needed it.
Okay, but why though?
She also asked Flores to build a 6 by 3 by 2 foot box to store books and other such things in.
Okay, but why though?
She then asked Flores to transport the filled, sealed box to a storage depot. Flores agreed, and Dorothea said she'd assist him.
Okay, but why though?
Dorothea would then ask Flores to stop on the Garden Highway in Sutter County so that she could dump the box of junk at the riverbank at an unofficial dumping site.
Okay, but why though?
On January 1st of 1986, a fisherman spotted the suspicious-looking coffin-like box near the river and called the police. Investigators opened the box and found the badly decomposed and unidentifiable body of an elderly man inside, and sadly, this man's body would remain unidentified for at least another 3 years. Still, life goes on though at the boarding house, and back at the boarding house, Dorothea was continuing to collect Gilmer's pension, and she would even write letters to his family explaining that the reason he hadn't contacted them was because he was in bed ill.
I'm for real. I'm for real.
And Puente would also continue to accept elderly boarders and was very popular with local social workers because she accepted referrals of the tough cases. Dorothea was still up to her old tricks though with the social security checks. She would collect the tenants' monthly mail each month before they saw it. She would cash the checks and she would pay them essentially pocket money. And the rest of the money would go on expenses. During this period, parole agents visited Dorothea at least 15 times, and even though she'd been ordered to keep away from the elderly and refrain from handling government checks, no violations were ever noted.
Going back, of course, you know how this whole thing got started was because of this last individual,
Right.
Montoya. Now, his disappearance is very suspicious. And then we talked to Mr. Sharp.
Mm-hmm.
And Mr. Sharp says he hasn't seen him for 3 months. But you said the other day.
Yeah,
And the
Sunday.
social worker hasn't seen him. So who is lying to me? Who is lying to me, Dorothea?
Well, I'm not. He was there Saturday and Sunday.
Suspicion was first aroused around Dorothea when neighbours noticed the odd activities of a homeless alcoholic known only as Chief. Dorothea had stated that she had adopted him and that he was her handyman. Dorothea had Chief dig in the basement and cart a load of soil and rubbish away in wheelbarrows. Chief later dismantled the garage in the backyard and installed fresh concrete there as well.
Okay, but why though?
And soon after he'd done this, Chief disappeared. Now here we are back in 1988. During that summer, the smell coming from Dorothea's garden got so bad that some of the neighbours would turn off their air conditioners and suffer the blazing summer heat instead of having their fans suck the stench into their homes.
Hey, what is that? That god-awful smell.
When the neighbours complained though, she made excuses like the sewers were backed up, or other times she blamed rats rotting under the floorboards or the fish emulsion that she would put on to fertilise her garden. She tried to blot out the smell by dumping bags of lime and gallons of bleach into the yard and spraying a parlour with lemon-scented air freshener when guests dropped by. But no matter what she did, the stink just refused to go away. It clung to the boarding house like a curse. But when more of her boarders started disappearing, a concerned social worker tipped off the police, who made a gruesome discovery of 7 bodies buried in her garden. 7! Not long after this, Dorothea appeared in court, accused of murdering her tenants so that she could steal their government benefit checks, just so that she could buy herself luxuries ranging from fancy things such as clothes to facelifts. This is a story of keeping up appearances.
She does try, bless her.
Dorothea Puente tried very hard to project a polished exterior, and this is where the cosmetic surgery and all the fancy clothes comes from. She also projected herself as an upstanding member of Sacramento society, a small-time socialite who gave to charity and rubbed elbows with second-tier politicians. No one would have suspected that this sweet-faced grandmother was systematically drugging and killing her frail boarders and then burying their remains in the yard she so lovingly tended to. She got away with murder for years. On the morning of November 11th in 1988, Detective John Cabrera and a couple of colleagues visited 1426 F Street looking for Alvaro Montoya, a mentally ill tenant whose social worker had reported him missing. Cabrera knocked at the front door and asked if him and his colleagues could come in and have a look around. The interior of the house was cluttered with vases and porcelain dolls and doilies and other old lady junk, and honestly, they didn't find anything on the interior of the house out of the ordinary. But then they looked in the backyard.
The other problem is this. You know, we go and talk to you. You're real good about it. And then we ask you for permission.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't even have to give us permission to look, but you were cooperating. You said sure. You gave us permission to dig around in the yard and look around. And then we dig, and lo and behold, we find what looks like the remains of a human being, clothing and all.
At the southeast corner of the property, the ground had been recently disturbed, so the men returned to their cars to retrieve shovels that they brought with them just on a hunch, and they began digging, and when they did, they turned up what looked like a lot of cloth and beef jerky.
What is that? What the fuck is that?
When their digging efforts were hampered by what appeared to be a tree root, Detective Cabrera whacked and jabbed at it with his shovel, but it wasn't going to budge. He then decided to climb down into the hole and get his hands dirty, and this is a decision that he would very soon come to regret.
Okay, but why though?
He wrapped his hands around it and he braced his feet and he started pulling as hard as he could.
I'm pulling really hard on it, dude.
And he pulled so hard that the thing broke loose. And when he pulled up his hand to see what he had in it, he could see very clearly that it wasn't a tree root, it was in fact a human bone.
Holy Jesus.
After hearing all the commotion in the garden with the police having just unearthed a human bone, Dorothea walked into the corner of the yard and peered down into the hole herself. When Detective Cabrera told her that they'd found what appeared to be part of a human skeleton, she acted shocked and upset, like she had no idea how this could possibly have ever happened.
Oh, you are so dumb. You are really dumb. For real.
The men kept on digging to see if there was anything else there to be found, and they would eventually stop digging when they found a shoe with a piece of foot still wedged in it.
Holy Jesus.
And decided to return the next day with some proper equipment. The next morning, a team of forensic anthropologists, officials from the coroner's office, and a county work crew equipped with some heavy machinery descended on the property. The first person they dug up from the yard was the body that Cabrera had stumbled upon the day before. It was a small female with grey hair that had rotted into a skeleton. A crowd of onlookers and reporters watched the proceedings from the other side of the high fence, and the mood was party-like. This was until a fresh body was unburied and carried into the coroner's wagon. And as the team drilled through a concrete slab in the back garden and prepared to excavate beneath it, Dorothea walked into the yard and approached Detective Cabrera wearing a cherry red overcoat and purple pumps and carrying a pink umbrella. She then asked if she could go to the Clarion Hotel just a few blocks away and have a cup of coffee.
Okay, but why though?
And he said, yeah, no problem. And then happily escorted her past reporters and curious onlookers so that she could get the hell out of there.
Okay, but why though?
When I was digging in the second hole, she was standing right here, and when I looked up, I could see her just, beaming down on me because she knew what was going to happen. I was maybe 3 feet away from the body, and then the next moment, she sent one of her friends out, and they stopped me and said she needed to speak to me. So she knew this was it. If we would have found the second body with her here, she would have had no place to escape to. So she took the opportunity to stop me, bring me up, ask me some questions, and it was then that she wanted to go for a walk to have a cup of coffee. And then everything from that point on was history.
But shortly after Dorothea's departure, in rapid succession, like a cherry red overcoat and purple pumps and carrying a pink umbrella. By the time the authorities noticed the white-haired landlady hadn't returned from the hotel for 4 hours, Dorothea had fled hundreds of miles away from Sacramento to Los Angeles.
When you're nobody, you're nobody. Nobody cares. So you disappear, you're a transient, or you're a bum, or you're an alcoholic. A lot of people think nobody ever cares.
Ultimately though, the grisly harvest of Puente's garden would be 7 people who had checked into her boarding house and never checked out. These 7 people were, firstly, 51-year-old Alvaro Montoya.
Mr. Montoya is dead.
No, he's not.
Okay, missed that. I'm just saying, I'm trying to surmise this and then we'll try to clear this up. That he is dead. And that somewhere in that backyard, Dorothea, that he's lying. Maybe along with other people.
No.
Okay? And I'm also going to tell you that we had this same information a year ago. A year ago? Yes. A year ago. So, what I'm telling you is not new to me.
64-year-old Dorothy Miller, who was an American Indian with a drinking problem who liked to recite poems about heartbreak. She was found with her arms taped to her chest with duct tape. Thirdly was 55-year-old Benjamin Fink, who was also an alcoholic.
Did he say that?
When I told him that he had to leave.
When was that?
I can't remember what month it was. He was only there a couple of months.
2-3 months ago?
Uh-huh. It was in the summertime sometime.
Now see, have you seen Ben Fink around?
No. I told him not to ever come back on the property.
But he was normally a regular around town. And you know what?
But he's lived in Marysville before.
Dorothea, if he'd have been in Marysville, he'd have been arrested. That's how Ben was. You know how Ben was.
No, I only knew him
drunk.
for 2 months.
He'd get drunk. He'd get a little goofy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then usually end up getting arrested, taking a detox or something. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Gone. What am I to think? What am I to think after hearing this a year and following along, watching, waiting, and then all of a sudden, lo and behold, I dig up a body in your backyard.
Fourth was Betty Palmer, who was 78, and her remains are still missing the head, hand, and lower legs.
Holy Jesus.
Nobody knows where they are.
What the fuck?
Victim number 5 was Leona Carpenter. She was also 78 and she was discharged from hospital to Dorothea's care in February of 1987. She spent several weeks agonizing on a sofa before eventually disappearing. She was buried near the back fence and it was her leg bone that Detective Cabrera mistook for a tree root. Victim number 6 was a man called James Gallop. He was a 62-year-old who had survived a heart attack and brain tumor surgery but sadly couldn't survive Dorothea Puente. Victim number 7, the final victim that was found in the back garden, was a lady called Vera Arden. She was 64 years old. When she was unearthed, her wristwatch was still ticking. Dorothea indulged her champagne taste with her dead tenant's income. A search at the boarding house had turned up a note on which Dorothea had scrawled the first initial of each victim and the amount of money she was getting from forging their disability and social security checks. Before Dorothea's arrest, she was making $5,000 a month off of her dead tenants.
What?
So all told, Dorothea Puente was charged with a total of 9 murders. These included the 7 people that were found in the back garden, Everson Gilmeth, the 77-year-old that she put in a box and dumped at the riverside, and also Ruth Monroe, the lady that she claimed had committed suicide after taking an overdose of codeine and paracetamol. According to investigators, most of her victims had been drugged until they overdosed. Dorothea would then wrap them up in bed sheets and plastic lining before dragging them into open pits in the backyard for burial. Granting a change of venue motion filed by Dorothea's lawyers Kevin Clymer and Peter Flowin, a judge transferred the trial from Sacramento to MONROE County. The trial would begin in October of 1992 and would end a year later. The prosecutor, John O'Mara, was the homicide supervisor in the Sacramento County District Attorney's Office. O'Mara called over 130 witnesses. He argued to the jury that Dorothea had been using sleeping pills to put her tenants to sleep. She would then suffocate them and would then hire convicts to dig holes and bury them in the backyard. Dorothea's defense lawyer, Clymer, he concluded his closing arguments by showing a picture commonly used in psychology that can be viewed in different ways, and saying, keep in mind, things are not always the way they seem. The jury deliberated for over a month and eventually found Dorothea guilty of only 3 of the murders. The jury was deadlocked 11-1 for conviction on all counts, and the lone holdout finally agreed to a conviction of 2 first-degree murder counts including special circumstances and 1 second-degree murder count. So for the 3 murders that Dorothea was actually convicted for, she would get life imprisonment without parole and would avoid the death sentence. For the rest of Dorothea's life, she maintained her innocence, insisting that all of her boarders died of natural causes. But it would be Dorothea that would eventually pass away of natural causes on March 27th of 2011, aged 82. Thank you for watching, guys. If you like what you've seen, please like and subscribe and give it a share, and we'll be back next week with another episode. Until then, take care and God bless.